If I don't correct or teach my child in the moment of challenging or inappropriate behavior, then how will they ever learn? This is the question that is on the mind of every parent of a PDA child or teen. And today, before we begin our Q&A, I'm going to answer that question because I know it was one that was really hard to wrap my mind around, and I know there are a lot of new people on this page, so I'm going to answer it for you. So the question is, if you don't correct or teach your child in the moment of their inappropriate behavior, how will they ever learn? Okay, so I'm going to start with a story from yesterday to illustrate some of the ideas behind this sometimes counterintuitive logic of not correcting in the moment. Okay, so yesterday was Sunday evening after 4 days of both boys being home, which means we had all hands on deck for the weekend, the bro pair, me, my husband, etc. So my husband was extremely tired, as was I, by the end of the day on Sunday, and we were sort of done entertaining, playing, engaging. And of course, my PDA son was walking around, I'm bored. What can I do? I'm bored, right? Because he didn't have that one-on-one engagement, which is signals of safety to the nervous system. Because his dad was like, I need a break. And when he was feeling activated, he started to immediately equalize to try and get back to a place of nervous system safety with his younger brother, William, who was playing Legos on a station that was left out for him, and that's usually where he does his Legos and works. And he's able to play independently as a 4.5-year-old without those constant signals of nervous system safety because he doesn't have a PDA nervous system. So immediately, as soon as we take away that undivided attention, my PDA son goes over to my younger son and starts messing with his stuff, right? He's taking pieces off what he's building. He's taking things that his younger brother has carefully placed, and he's pretending like he doesn't have them. It ends up with them chasing each other around the room. It's starting to be dangerous, and of course, this propels us to start engaging again. But in the moment, of course, what's happening in our minds as parents? We're super frustrated. We're super activated. We're exhausted because we've literally spent the entire weekend, the 4 days, giving one-on-one attention to one or both of the kids. And if it wasn't us, it was the au pair. And the second we take away that one-on-one attention from Cooper, he starts equalizing, right? So this is the cost benefit that we talk about on this page. And so in this moment, what I want to do is be like, dude, we've spent the entire weekend giving you everything that you wanted and paid all this attention to you, and you literally get to do so much more play and exciting stuff than any other kid on the planet. Can you just give us 5 minutes? However, I know that I can't say that because it's activating to his nervous system and it's not affirming to who he is. I know cognitively it's not his fault that he's having this reflexive response to his brother, who's the weakest. Remember, equalizing is often towards the safest, which is the lead parent, or the weakest in the family. Okay, so what do we do? In the moment, my husband does set a boundary and gently removes him to the other room with his service dog so that William can keep playing without having his things destroyed, right? Which is fair. My son is continually getting more activated in the other room, and he's saying, I didn't have that piece, over and over and over and over again. Okay, so my husband walks upstairs because he's a little bit activated, and I go in and I diffuse, okay? Which is counter to what my nervous system wants to do, which is you can't do that, you can't treat your brother like that, etc. But I'm like, I hear you. He keeps repeating that he didn't have this Lego piece. I'm like, I hear you. Are you doing okay? He didn't go into a full-down meltdown, and we sort of left him with the TV and the dog and his iPad, and he recovered. Then I saw him come back into the room, and he had put his clothes on upside down, like he was wearing his shirt as pants, and he had his pants on his head, so he's using humor to equalize in the situation. And he comes back to William, and he says, "William, I'm sorry." And I'm like, oh my God, don't move a muscle, because what is happening here? And he's like, "I'm sorry." And he's like, "Did I have that piece? Did I drop it in there?" And it was like an admission that he actually had done the thing that he was saying, no, I didn't do, because we know for many of our children, even if we see them do something with our own two eyes, they're going to deny it when they're in their survival brain, right? But I didn't harp on that. I didn't correct him. Neither did his father. We diffused and set a small boundary, which we're able to do because now we have established trust and connection over the course of 4 years of this type of practice. Okay, so this moment floored me, because although my son will sometimes say sorry, although not often, he actually admitted that he did the thing that he was vehemently denying 1 minute earlier when he was in his survival brain. So let's break down what happened here as an illustration of the basic theory behind why we don't correct, teach, sanction in the moment of activation, or even immediately afterwards with these PDA kids. Okay, so there are 4 things I really want to touch on before we get into your questions. So as I'm chatting, feel free to drop in questions, because we're going to have a few minutes to answer questions. Doesn't have to be about this topic. So in the moment, when our child is equalizing, my son was bored, which was dysregulating to him. He is in the survival part of his brain. In that part of the brain, things are operating on a subconscious and reflexive level. They're oriented towards survival. And for him, what activates the nervous system as a PDA child is the perception of a loss of autonomy or equality and basic nervous system dysregulation as a baseline, because he has a nervous system disability. That's what it is, right? So when he loses that one-on-one engagement with dad who needs a break, he immediately starts equalizing, okay? So this doesn't mean we can't set boundaries, but what it means is he cannot understand or access any lessons we are trying to teach him. And in fact, if we do that, it's going to escalate that threat response, because of the root cause, which is the perception that you're above them, can activate the nervous system. They go into fight or flight or freeze and drive him deeper into the survival brain. What happens in the survival brain? You can't access rational thought, you can't learn, you can't access empathy, and you can't make decisions, okay? So this is just the brain science of how to approach a PDA child or teen. It's not a philosophy. It's just if we can be really realistic and see the actual mechanisms of what's happening, we realize we don't really have a choice, right? We can activate or accommodate. The second thing I want to say is they often already know right from wrong. They know that they're supposed to apologize. They know that they're not supposed to be, messing with their brother's things and destroying the thing they just built, okay? The thing is, they can't access and apply that knowledge that exists here, right? They're in a part of the brain where they can't access that knowledge. So if we approach these kids with I need to teach them not to do that in the moment when it's being driven from that red part of the brain, then again, we're operating from the wrong logic. We're operating from the logic of the frontal lobe, not the limbic system, okay? So how do we do this? Unfortunately, for us as parents, it has to be a long-term commitment to accommodating the way that the brain works, so that they are spending more and more time in the frontal lobe and strengthening neural pathways to the thinking brain. This requires consistency and going against your conditioning as a parent, often for years. Okay, the story I'm describing to you is the culmination of 4 years of this approach, of diffusing, accommodating, of course setting boundaries when it's a health and safety issue, but in the moment, not correcting, teaching, or consequencing, okay? Now I might talk to my son in a moment of regulation using other tools like sitting on the ground, nervous system safety signals, using declarative language to discuss like, hey, William got really upset. I noticed that when his thing got destroyed. However, for the first years of this approach, I couldn't even do that because if I brought up something, he would immediately activate and escalate and say, stop talking, right? Which is what many of you are going to be experiencing, especially if you're new to this page, new to PDA, or your child or teens in burnout, right? So we have to think of it sequentially, where you might have to give up that tendency to try and teach, punish. Punishment is not part of our vernacular or way of operating with our children. It used to be before I understood PDA and neurodiversity. So it's going to take a lot of time, but the theory and the logic and what I've seen in the data in my own home and with hundreds of families I've worked with is that over the long term, as they spend more and more time in the thinking brain, they can access the skills and learn from you modeling. Right? So like you're constantly showing compassion, showing patience, saying please and thank you, being respectful to them as modeling, even if you're not receiving it in return. And that's going to bring up a lot of triggers for you, right? And it's going to feel like what I used to feel like, and sometimes still do when I'm stressed, of like, I'm the parent here, I'm in control, I need you to listen to me, right? Like that energy is never going to function, and it's never going to serve you as a parent of a PDA child or teen. And then, so the fourth point I want to make is that making this paradigm shift, which is really a paradigm shift, right? From the conventional wisdom, a lot of what exists about child development, education, parenting, it's a leap of faith and trust, because in the short to even medium term, you're not going to see necessarily your child saying thank you or apologizing, right? Like in the short to medium term, we're focusing on basic needs, connection, nervous system health, which often comes at the expense of all the other things you're focused on. Like, do they comply? Are they polite? Et cetera, et cetera. Over years, I believe, and I've seen, those glimmers start to emerge because they're spending more and more time in their thinking brain through all the what feel like very radical bad parenting accommodations. Okay, so it takes trust and also a deep understanding and reminding yourself of how the brain works. Because if the root cause is always a perception of a loss of autonomy and a perception of a loss of equality being what activates the nervous system, then those approaches in the moment of activation are just going to make it worse, right? It feels deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge that truth, but again, this isn't a parenting philosophy. This is a caregiving and parenting approach to what is, I believe, a nervous system disability. But we can teach our kids to manage their disability. We can support them in creating new neural pathways. It just has to be done in a way that feels counterintuitive and like bad parenting and requires you developing an inner knowing or returning to an inner knowing that can block out all the judgment from everyone else around you, because you will receive it. Okay? Yeah, so I just got a question from Honest Mommy. How do you handle the other people in their lives who might not know about PDA or know the best way to approach them? So you mentioned teachers, friends, relatives. So each one of those is going to be a different approach because it's a strategic decision-making process. Right? So in the Paradigm Shift program, for example, we do an entire 2 weeks just on that question. So I can't go too deeply into like that whole module and like 2 weeks of spot coaching and all of that. But what I will say is like the first needle moving step, I think there's two. I'd say the first needle moving step for most parents is making the mindset shift from going from I need to explain and convince, which often has, and that might be true for teachers or pediatricians, but with a lot of other people in our lives, we are trying to explain or convince people because we're prioritizing their comfort and preferences over the needs of our children. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is recognize where we're doing that and realize it actually might have less to do with our child and more to do with our own discomfort around setting boundaries. Okay, which was certainly true for me. Like I'm not speaking in a judgmental way. This was a big part of my journey, especially as someone who never wanted to rock the boat or upset anyone and always was like monitoring other people's emotional responses to my presence in a hypervigilant way, which is like what high functioning codependency is. So part of this means going from the thought that you have to convince or explain or get people on board to focusing on advocating for specific needs and using nonviolent communication for that specific request. So for example, instead of trying to convince a mother-in-law, like, I really need you to be more supportive. This is how PDA works. My son needs to have constant screens. We may not be able to go to Thanksgiving because he needs to be accommodated, right? Like this is all happening in the ether, sort of nebulous area of like communication. Whereas we want to narrow it down to like one request of like, you know, Suzanne, mother-in-law Suzanne, can I make a request? When we come for Thanksgiving, my son will need to have an iPad and a room that he can retreat to. He will not be able to sit at the table except for dessert, and I might not be able to socialize while I'm there because I'm going to be paying attention to him. Will this work for the Thanksgiving? And then if the answer is no, if they say no to the request, then we move to decision making, right? Of like, if it's a no, are we still going to that Thanksgiving, right? So it's a real mindset shift around like your job being to convince everyone else around you about PDA versus making specific requests for what your child needs, because those can't be argued with. They're just like, I'm making this request, is it a yes or no, versus do you believe in PDA, which is like, as we all know, going to end us up in tears and arguments and not productive conversations. All right, so happy to see you guys all here. I tried to start this live twice. Good morning from Minnesota, yeah, Midwest. Tried to start it twice, but I had a poor internet connection, so I was a few minutes late. Good morning, Mom. How are you? Yeah. 2 people said, I feel like this is a page out of my life. Yeah, so these are themes, right? This is because this is how our children's brains work and how we respond as parents, which has a lot to do with our own conditioning, maybe our own neurotype. So these are not just you experiences, right? Like you're not doing anything wrong. Humor to equalize. Ugh, so much truth, and I'm putting it together for my son. This is one of his behaviors. Yeah. And I actually think of humor, you know, I know it can get into sort of like manic and not like safe and social humor. So I want to say this with a caveat, but like what I saw my son do yesterday, I was like, yes, like this is such adaptive and appropriate way of equalizing to get his body back to a place of safety when he's perceiving threat in a way that's not harming another sentient being, right? And so, you know, another question that this leads into is like, well, what about in adulthood? I think there's a lot of opportunity to recognize that there are many ways of equalizing and exerting some control over like a societal norm of how you wear your clothes in a certain way in order to get back to nervous system safety that doesn't involve destroying, you know, his younger brother's things or calling me names, etc. But of course, if they're fully in fight or flight, we're going to get more of the like oppositional, defiant, reflexive behaviors. You allow the very nice person to come out and be his best person. Yes, I agree. That's my mom. She always comes to my lives. And she's a huge support to my son as well. My daughter will play on her own for chunks of time or with her sister, but she's only happy if she's in charge. Yeah. And or controlling the play. Is that still a sign of PDA? So, I can't fully say, just based on that information, what a neurotype is. The way I would think about it, so patterns I've noticed is that with more internalized expression, so not as much externalized fight or flight, you may have children who are more able to play independently. I've seen that pattern. Also remember that other friends or siblings can play that role of nervous system safety, that one-on-one that they need, especially if they feel like they're in charge, because they're getting that nervous system input in a way that feels safe to them, right? So that could be the role that her sister is playing, whether or not she knows it. So that certainly could describe a PDA child, but I would think about a lot of other things like, is there a basic need that's being impacted? Like at least one, whether it's hygiene, whether it's safety, whether it's, hygiene would be like cutting hair, clipping nails, brushing teeth, and bath in a way that's not just sensory, like it's the autonomy driver, eating, sleeping, and or toileting. And then I would think about like that mechanism that we're talking about, like when your child does activate, whether it's down the fight flight pathway or the more freeze pathway, is what's causing that sensory, temperament, a lack of social communication understanding, or is it like directly related to the perceived loss of autonomy and equality? Right? And you will start to notice this when you start looking through that lens. And what can be complex is like our children can have more than one thing, right? Like they might be avoiding putting their shoes on because they don't like the way they feel, and because we're making them put their shoes on, which activates the nervous system. So if you haven't already, Danny, I would watch the 70-minute Clarity Masterclass, which is free in my bio, because it goes deep into the 5 characteristics that we can look at and help you understand your child through that lens. Honest Mommy says, training myself to make the right decisions when all I want to do is scream, reprimand, or correct. That's the hardest part. How? Yeah. So that's the work, right? Like you can have all the information, but actually making the paradigm shift is hard. So, and it needs to be done in community from my perspective. So that is what we do in the paradigm shift, which is like the signature program. That's like a 3-month program, intensive with other families. And then once you sort of graduate from the live portion, then you are in the alumni community where you continue to like support each other for your lifetime. And that's like what I do in coaching. It's also, there's an element of community here where you can see other people's comments and what they're working on. But I think people are in very different parts of their journey, right? Like there's a lot of negotiating of like, how is this, the best way to do it? And it can be hard sometimes to like trust your own instinct. But, I think a lot of healing takes place also with that sense of belonging of like, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. I can trust my intuition and I can learn how to track data for my own child and then start forging my own path. And then of course, like nervous system work, which we do a little bit of in the Paradigm Shift program. Thank you for sharing this relatable experience. I have 3 boys. The youngest is PDA and it's a struggle with his older brothers. Yeah, it's siblings. Siblings are probably the hardest aspect of parenting a PDA child or teen. Yeah, and I will say, like, we're just now, after 4 years, like, able to have these moments where both kids are in the house playing and we're not totally one-on-one with one of them. For about 3 years, and we'll probably do it again, we've separated the kids entirely for holidays, for vacations. Like, for the last couple Christmases, my husband has taken my son one place and I've taken my younger son to be with family. So yeah, it's in the short term really prioritizing that accommodation so that they can get to a place where you have that window of tolerance. So I have to jump off because I am going to yoga. Speaking of nervous systems, I hope this was helpful for you to start making the shift and understanding the logic behind it. All right, everybody, have a good day. Bye.